don't know, I'm so happy this is our last session, I believe, other than the closing session. So thanks for sticking it out if you've been attending all of the sessions. And, I'm Richard Kiley. I'm a senior fellow in the Office of Engagement and Initiatives, which will become a new center at Cornell fairly soon. And I'm excited about that. But I'm very excited to be moderating a stellar panel of my favorite people who can speak to the topic of today, which is best practices and principles of good practice in campus community partnerships. And I'll just go over a little bit of the format and then some of the questions that I've asked the panelists to consider, and also describe who we have on the panel, so and then they can talk a little bit more about who they are when they're presenting. So maybe you could just raise your hand when I say your name. So people, well, you have your name there on the Zoom, so I guess you don't have to raise your hand. That'd be like, so Faith Valencia Forrester from Australia. She is the director of the Service Learning Unit at the Griffith University. She is just a wonderful collaborator, and I'm really looking forward to her sharing her insights today. We also are joined by Janice McMillan. She's at the University of Cape Town in South Africa. Also has worked many years like Faith on campus community partnerships, and I'm very much looking forward to your insights. And then you've probably seen Shorna already, but she's joining us as well. And Shorna Allred in the Department of Natural Resources, she's a professor there. The questions, so what we're going to do is we have three panelists. They've prepared sort of their comments for 15 minutes. I'm a horrible timekeeper, so I guess Amanda said she was going to be back up, and so is Amy. So we might raise our hand when you're reaching those 13, 14 minutes. And then I've asked them to talk about a couple of things, to talk about a particular partnership they've been involved in, community campus partnership. What are some of the core principles that have guided the creation and sustainability of that partnership? What are some of the good practices that you would like to highlight? And then what are some of the lessons learned along the way? We're going to go in reverse alphabetical order. So Faith is going to start, if that's okay. And then Janice will follow Faith, and then Shorna. And then I'm hoping in the last 10 minutes, we'll have an opportunity for some discussion and questions. And, if you have an urgent question during the panel presentations, please feel free to post that in the chat, and we might be able to fit it in. But I think we'll try to get to most of the questions at the end. So without much further ado, Faith, if you want to begin your presentation, the mystery of whether to use the PowerPoint or not is going to happen right now. Can't wait. Oh, you're on.
I just realized that.
Always happens.
If I share the PowerPoint, just so everyone can see how bad it is, it says advanced sharing. I'm not going to worry about it. It doesn't want me to share. Okay, so
you should be able to share. Try it again.
Probably just had to adjust the settings. Yeah, try again.
Nope, it's not going to work. So I'm just going to take Nara's advice, and I'll just start. So first of all, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners and take this moment, as is appropriate, to acknowledge the traditional owners and custodians of the land that I'm currently on, which is the land of the Yugambeh people. And I'd also like to acknowledge the traditional owners and custodians of the land where you're based. I pay my respect to the elders past, present, and the emerging leaders in our community. And I'm grateful for their wisdom, their connection to country, and for sharing that connection and wisdom with me. It's also important in these moments to acknowledge that for our First Peoples here in Australia, that sovereignty was never ceded. I'd also like to first off start by saying that I really don't know anything. And I think Amanda, in your last session, you kind of asked the question about what you that tripartite moment where you know what you don't know. And this that classic, the more I know, the more I don't know. And I really kind of feel a little bit fraudulent in this space, sort of putting myself up as anybody. Like when I look at Janice and Richard and the other people that are here, I've been in this space for the last 10 years by accident, not by design. And I stumble through every moment that I'm here. So I just want to kind of premise that I'm really someone that just kind of falls through all of these spaces that I've worked in with his domestic violence, homelessness, digital inclusion, First Peoples. I'd really tried very hard to kind of form relations and support our First Peoples. And I'm the classic person that does the wrong thing going into a space and then coming out of a space. And the reason I do that is because there's just so many spaces that need, well, communities that I see benefits for our students and for the communities to work with. But ironically, even though I end up going into those spaces and coming out, I always end up back in those spaces again, not by design. I just kind of stumble through. So some of the work that I've done most recently was last year, obviously with COVID, we developed a project where we worked with our community partners virtually. We worked with students and partners as equal partners within those virtual spaces. And we were very fortunate to actually have 89 community partners join with us to work with about 600 students. So the exciting part of that project was the scalability, the impact that the students reported and the community partners, they all reported that they had really good experience and good outcomes, and it was actually tangible outcomes for the communities that the students worked on and were able to produce. And the communities felt that they were really getting a lot of out of those relationships with the students, and that it was a benefit to them that they were able to share their knowledge and expertise and help guide the thinking of the students that were going to be the change makers once they graduated, and share those insights. So that's kind of like, I haven't really given you a good overview, but I just want to say that I'm a scattergun into what I do. So the core principles that guided the creation and sustainability of these partnerships. And Richard will know, when he came out to Australia, Uncle John Graham is a Kumba saltwater man and a traditional owner here in Australia. And he always talks about the 4 R's, and I'm sure that most of the people here incorporate them in their own practice. Uncle John talks about relationships. And I guess for me, relationships are the core at everything that I do. Every project I work on, every community engagement process, those relationships are the core of where I'm able to develop and work within those spaces. So, and that really comes, as you will know, taking the time to build trust, engaging early, but most importantly is the authenticity in those relationships. I don't form the relationships with a view that I'm going to create this relationship to be able to develop this community engagement practice. I always try and come with a genuine heart into all of my relationships, and I form them as authentically as possible with a curiosity and a genuine wanting to know and understand and form friendships. And I'm really grateful that I've been able to do that. And that's as much from the partners and the people, the stakeholders that we've been able to work with. And that authenticity, I think, really creates a basis for trust and respect, which happens to be the next R. So always go in with respect with our community partners, and I respect that they're the experts. We in the university are not the experts in this space. I think sometimes we fall into that trap, and community partners and sectors and spaces that we work in are treated as subjects or objects for evaluation, or you know, I can't just think of the word right now, but I've learned through the process of doing this work is that I really don't know the space the self-advocates, the service providers, they're the people that actually know this space and they're the experts. The wisdom lies within the community partners and the self-advocates, and I really try to acknowledge that in the work and the relationships that we're building. That reciprocity is such a key element, and everybody talks about reciprocity, but finding the space for that reciprocity to occur is sometimes quite difficult. So I really try and take a moment to kind of listen, and I'll get into that, to the community partners of what they want and how they want these projects or processes to move forward. A key element is that I include is reflection, because if I don't reflect on what I've learned, it's in that reflection, and I know we know that reflection is so key, but it's when I can actually take a moment and reflect on those processes. That's where I start to identify, oh, I didn't know that when I went in. Oh, that process has changed, or that language has changed, or that space has changed from when I was here before. I kind of rely on a wise practice framework when I'm designing and developing projects or with community partners. And wise practice is essentially premised on notions of universal design, equity, and inclusion. So the wise practice approach allows for complex learning and knowledge transfers. And it also understands that it allows for a contextual understanding of a variety of experiences, and that includes the practices and methods of belief and knowledge sharing and transfer. So it's very much premised around different cultural and experiential understandings of places and knowledge. There's different ways of knowing and being, and different forms of knowledge. So we have a great deal of respect for the different ways of sharing that knowledge as well within the community spaces, and we don't assume that a Western banking model of education is the only way. So that kind of really forms the core of what we do in the projects that we work with as well. So some of the good practices that I'd like to highlight is to listen. And listening, I know we listen, but we get really busy in our academic work. And when we're trying to kind of manage multiple different competing demands, like workloads with students and coursework and service and teaching and research, when you're working with community partners, I really try to go in with a concept of deep listening, or Dajiri. And this is best. Yeah, you can go watch TV. I'm so sorry. Dajiri is a concept that's described by Auntie Miriam Rose, who's a traditional owner and custodian from Central Australia. And she describes it as listening to country. And it's that moment where you're very present and you're listening deeply to what's being said. And I take that when I go to community partners, and I try really hard to listen and hear, learn their language, learn their experience, and be guided by that language and that experience, and understand that it's not me coming in and guiding this project or this process. I'm listening to the community partners, and I'm deeply listening with my heart to what they're saying and what's not being said, and making it okay for them to share that with me. I also try and minimize the burden of work on the community partner. And I guess the way I see that is our community partners, they're already overworked, under-resourced, working really hard in the spaces that they're in. So I think universities have time and resources that the community organisations or the sectors or the space don't often have. So I really try to minimize the burden on them. So I take a lot of that on, or my team does, in terms of the administration and support for projects. I really want to make it as easy as possible for the partnership to work with us, so that it's not another thing that they have to do or carry. And I'm very much guided by how much what kind of lead or capacity they have to participate. And then I try and fill the gaps where it's not possible. I basically want to make it as easy as possible for them to collaborate with us and us to collaborate with them. Basically means more work for us, but I think that's part of the privileged position that we're in, that we're able to do that. I always set our partners up as teaching elders. So in a First Peoples context, traditional owners such as Uncle John or Eddie Sinnott that come in, I acknowledge their knowledge and wisdom, even though they don't have academic credentials. I try and make sure that they are recognised for their within an academic environment with our students as experts in their field, and along the same lines as the academics that they might come across. And that's part of my decolonising the academy approach. Be kind is another thing that I always try and try to do. Sometimes it's difficult when I get stressed, and for, you know, the other things is to leave a tiny footprint but a large legacy. So that's something that I really try and do with our projects as well. Some lessons that I've learned along the way is always engage with fresh eyes and know that things have changed and evolved since I last was in the space. And that might only be 2 months ago. For example, I did a disability project in 2017. And then again, I revisited disability with similar partners and some of the same partners in last year. And just the language had changed so much in that short 3-year period. So I'm always a student. I'm always there to learn. I'm never the expert. I'm always the student. Do the work to make the relationship solid and lasting. So important. So that comes back to developing that trust and respect with the partners, so that they're always wanting and get to engage with you, and you to kind of be open to engage with them. Never forget your privilege. I do this all the time, not on purpose. And I'm just really grateful that many of my community partners are kind and gracious when they remind me of that. And then the last thing is that we have to do our job. And that is within our privileged positions to challenge those systems of power. And I'll share with you recently, going back to my disability project, in 2017, some media wanted to do some interviews about the project I was working on. And at the time, I thought it was really important that the voice of the people from that community were featured in the story. So I asked one of my project partners, who was a lady with a disability. She was actually deaf. She had to go and ask her supervisor, who was a white able-bodied woman, who chose to do that media interview in her stead. I probably was a little uncertain at my role in the space at the time, but I know I felt really uncomfortable with how that situation played out. I'm currently working with another group where another woman with a disability has written a project. And again, we're faced with a very similar situation, where I said to her at this moment, I said, it's up to you to do that interview. It's your voice, it's your work. You need to own that space. And she said to me, how do I do that? And I realized in that moment, this is part of that reflexive place coming through, that it wasn't her job to do that. It was my job to stand in and make sure that it was her voice that was heard, and it was her voice that was featured in any of the coverage that came out of it, not the other woman who was a leader in the organization who were wanting to take that space. So that's my challenge that I'm left with moving forward from now, is that I need to go and stand up and make sure that that woman there is actually heard and recognized, and it's her voice that's front and center, not other people speaking with no lived experience in those spaces. I think I finished in time, did I?
That was perfect. 4:25 was when we were gonna, you know,
Kick me off?
Exactly. Well, we'd never do that. So maybe hold your questions, hold them, put them in the chat, and then I'd love it for Janice. We'll let you know. Maybe I'll go like this when you've got like a minute left or something, just so you know, so you don't have to pay attention to the time. Yeah, so please, thanks so much, Faith, for sharing everything. That was perfect. It's wonderful.
Yeah, just thank you, Faith, very much for raising some of the similar issues I'm going to, but from a different context. And I think that's what's really interesting, is how the thrust of my presentation, I think, is that context matters in this work. So I'm just going to try and share my screen and see if it works. Why is it doing something funny? should be sharing my desktop. Can you see that? Can you see a PowerPoint?
Yep, it's great.
Okay, cool. Great. Okay. So I'm going to leave it in that mode if that's okay. Is it big enough on the screen? Is that okay?
Yes, yes.
Okay, so I've kind of just translated Richard's title into this notion of engaging the social, and that relationships and context are central in this work. And I will reflect on a particular partnership. I worked at the Stanford Cape Town Centre for a period of 5 years as a service learning coordinator in Cape Town. So I'm South African from Cape Town. And I'm going to just reflect a little bit on that partnership, some of the things that emerged from that. But first, I just want to locate myself. I think it's really important to do that. So just this is the University of Cape Town is where I work permanently. That's my permanent position. I've been at UCT for many, many years. And so that's our campus to the foot of mountains. Recently, we had some really bad fires. You might have read about that. And that we are Research One institution. You probably can't see it, but there's a statue of Cecil John Rhodes right in the middle of the photograph on the left, and on the right is the same statue being brought down in the Rhodes Must Fall, Fees Must Fall student protests of 2015, which was protests around colonialism, around racism at the institution. And it was a seminal moment at UCT in terms of where we are now. So that's my home base in Cape Town. I'm South African from Cape Town. So let me just locate myself a little bit further. I think it's quite important. Just so people know a little bit about me, I actually was in the nonprofit sector for 3 or 4 years before I came to the university sector. I joined UCT in 1994, which was also the first year of our democratic elections. In fact, I joined the month of our first elections in April. And I joined as an adult educator. I joined in the field of adult education and eventually moved into community engagement. My own background is sociology, and I'm really interested in this notion of boundary work. And my PhD question was actually, what happens when the university meets the community? And I was really interested and am interested in that intersection. I've done some work around global citizenship, Stanford program. But at the bottom, I also want to say that I'm a white upper middle class, cisgender, English speaking South African woman from settler ancestors. It's quite a mouthful. But I think actually, when we often introduce and locate ourselves, we don't use those as markers of location. We talk about our qualifications, but actually there's a whole lot there around being from settler ancestors. Faith, I really liked your land acknowledgement opening as well, and pronoun she, her, and hers. So that's the kind of introduction I also want to give, because it impacts very much on the lenses that I can bring to practice and the way that shapes the world that I know, given my own particular background. So back to kind of Richard's prompts to us, if I have to think about principles, so just a bit of context perhaps before that. The Stanford program in Cape Town started in 2009. In fact, Tim Stanton and I set up the center. He was the director, I was the service learning director. It basically, Stanford operates on a quarter system. We had 2 groups of students, between 20 and 25 students coming twice a year to a small campus in Cape Town. And I built a whole range of community partnerships, or at least I introduced students to a range of community partnerships that I'd already been building at UCT. So I worked as a service learning director for the Stanford program. I can talk more about the program, but I think it's actually perhaps the principles and practices that are of more interest. Similarly to Faith, I start with relationships. That's the absolute starting point for practice. And if there isn't a relational, angle to the engagement, then I think we're really starting from the wrong starting point. I think we dismiss, or we don't think often enough about power inherent, particularly in global North-South engagements. And I've been in conversation actually with Richard and other things, and I'm really challenged by that, and particularly with my own positionality as a white upper middle class English speaking South African, born here, but with so many of the privileges in a sense that often afforded in, through global North contexts. So it's a Faith, a bit like you, grappling the whole time with issues. The constant grapple for me in terms of my own positionality and privilege. I think in this work, we mustn't avoid issues of vulnerability, whether it's vulnerability on the part of our students, whether it's vulnerability on the part of our community members. It's not a weakness, but it's actually a presence. Us showing vulnerability is actually showing presence in these contexts of deep inequality in South Africa in particular. I think the fourth principle is something that, in fact, Tim Stanton helped me to understand, is that we talk about reciprocity, and I agree with that, but at different times in a partnership, certain knowledge might need to be foregrounded, and at other times, other knowledge might need to be backgrounded. So sometimes, in fact, the university knowledge might need to be foregrounded in a partnership. So it's fluid. Partnerships are not static, they're fluid, and I think that's really important. The next point is that place matters, and that's why I say context is central. So in my case, Cape Town in particular, as a city, a South African city shaped by colonialism and apartheid, actually matters. The fact that students can, on the one hand, get a cafe latte and 15 minutes later be in the middle of a neighborhood that's very, very different with more traditional indigenous ways of knowing, is part of the attraction for students, but it's also part of the problem. And I think it's just grappling with those kinds of inequalities. And Cape Town is attractive for students. It's very beautiful, but some of that attraction is also problematic. This notion Afrikaans is one of the languages here. And when I was in the NPO sector, the own way of doing my job performance review was through this notion of praktijkbegeleiding, which means I will accompany you through your practice. So I'm not going to review your performance. I'm going to accompany you in the practice that you're doing. And I think this notion of accompaniment and practice is really important with societal partners and shapes really how I think about my teaching. So when I teach students to accompany community partners through the practice that they're already involved in. And students are kind of intervening in that practice at particular moments in time. So there's a temporal dimension to engagements. And then practices emerge from those principles. So I found myself in talking to a colleague, Nick Longo at Providence College, who was bringing a group of students over to Cape Town. In the middle of the conversation as an introductory meeting, I just found myself asking this question. I said to the students, what verbs do you travel with when you travel in this work? Do you come to help, to serve, or do you come to learn, understand, witness, accompany? So what is the language? How do we language this work, and what are the verbs that you travel with? I think also I'm actually I don't really engage in service learning much anymore. I'm much more interested in engagement work rather than service work, and learning rather than service. So there was an article I used to shift from kind of service learning to actually telling students to learn about service when they come into the context in Cape Town. So yeah, shifting from service to focusing on engagement and relationships. And I think that's what Faith has mentioned as well. I think empathy is a really important component to this work, and it's about holding space. And I think it's a competence that can actually be acquired. Maybe we don't necessarily always feel empathetic immediately, but I think thinking about how do we hold an empathetic space in this work is really important. And I've talked about accompaniment before, but this notion of service as accompaniment is how I try and help students engage in their practice. So very often in educational design and as universities, we very often think about what do we start with our disciplines? So what do we know? So how much knowledge can we actually impart? And Faith, you were doing a really useful critique of that. And I think we need to ask a different set of questions of partnerships. So I think instead of starting with the what, or the what, even the what for and the how, is where. So space and place really matter, whether it's in person or virtual. It's about the context, but we need to start and ask ourselves, what is it about the place? What is it about the history that we need to think about? And who are the people involved in the partnership? Ask deep questions. Do we really know who this partnership is actually involving? Because it's a relational is the main thing. And then asking why is there the need for the partnership? Is it about student learning? And I mean, these sound like simple questions, but when you put them all together in a partnership context, I think they're quite complex actually. And what is the anticipated change? Is it, for whom? And how do we ensure that we can actually work towards that change? And how do we navigate that journey? I think the when and the what, the when I think is, I meant to say the where is the starting point. So the what is the content? I mean, what is the nature of the subject? Is it public health? Are we learning about development? And what are the objectives? And then then how do we actually build the partnership in context is where I think we need to get to once we've addressed all the others, is what does that partnership actually need to look like? I was trying to see where that was Richard's hand up. Richard, was that your hand up? No, not yet. Okay. So, and this sort of series of questions actually comes from the trade union context. A woman called Jane Vella, who's originally from Canada, and she would ask the question of who. When you start to design a curriculum, you don't start with the what, but you start with the who. Who are your students? Who's going to be engaged in it? So how do we think about the questions we ask around partnerships? So just maybe some of the lessons that I've learned in and through context and relationships. And I haven't really shared this much with anyone. And Richard, you've known my work in Stanford for quite some time, but I received a huge amount of criticism from my colleagues for taking on the Stanford role, because, you know, working with American students in a South African context, you know, this work is political and education is political. And I was using my expertise and, in fact, you know, sharing it with an extremely privileged group of students. And so I came from an adult education base, which was a critical space. And a lot of my colleagues were profoundly critical of my decision to take on the role. And it was a very interesting space to think about right from the get-go, is how do I take on that critique? But it was kind of unexpected. And it was a real eye-opener for myself. Yeah, at times, that I've talked about this, at times during a partnership, specific expertise might need to be foregrounded, and then other times different expertise. And so how do we navigate that, the kind of fluid nature of partnerships? Then they're not static, they're fluid, and they shift and they change. I think positionality is critical. And I think we need to think about the whiteness and talk about the whiteness of this work, whether we're talking about whiteness in terms of the color of our skin, or whether we're talking about whiteness as the kinds of the dominant values, the white supremacy culture, you know, how we think and view the world. Through what lenses do we view the world, and how do we begin to, if the word is decolonize, I'm hesitant to use that word, because I don't believe that I can necessarily decolonize. I can create spaces where students can feel that they're in a space that offers the opportunity to have a decolonized experience, possibly, but I'm very cautious about decoloniality as a white person and offering that up. I'm doing quite a lot of work actually around decentering whiteness in my own campus context presently. And I think race and whiteness is a huge issue that we need to talk a lot more about in this work. The one concept that isn't talked about a lot, and very few curricula actually talk about it, is this notion of development. And I think as well, when I came from the NPO sector, one of the things that I took with me, besides this notion of praktijk begeleiding, was this fact that development is held in relationships. It's not about infrastructure. It's not about systems. It's actually about people and relationships. And if we say that development is held in relationships by people through engagement, we have to think about power, and we have to think about development as a core concept. And then I want to say all of these issues are magnified when we talk about the global context, the global engagement. And in South Africa, we have the highest rate of inequality in the world. You know, the COVID context, we can't not talk about COVID and the impact. We don't have vaccines freely available in our context. You know, and what does that mean in terms of students coming into our context, if in my language, and we're talking about global partnerships. So I think the COVID context has really shifted a lot of thinking around resources and power relations for me, in terms of how we do this work, how we think about global partnerships, whether they're face-to-face or virtual. Obviously that does make a difference, but I'm just super aware about the whole thing of vaccinations, and I found myself reaching out quite critically to colleagues and friends where vaccines are more available, and I think I'm open to being critiqued for my criticalness, but I think it's just, yeah, I think there's a moment right now that we have to actually hold and really look at quite deeply. And my very last slide is just kind of trying to think through, well, how can we perhaps put this into some sort of a framework for partnerships. So if you think about the centrality of contexts and engagement and relationships, and if context is really put foregrounded in this work, it has to ask questions of whose knowledge and what forms of practice need to build a partnership. So I think we have to start with context. We have to start with with questions about why and what for. And we have to try and understand this notion of the social, the broader context, and in global North-South partnerships in particular, and this is for students and educators. And then, that asks questions about the practice. So what is the nature of the partnership? What are the skills and values that are needed by students and faculty and societal partners to engage in ways that don't reproduce power relations? And then how do we move towards transdisciplinarity? How do we move towards understanding the limits of the disciplines, the disciplining nature of the disciplines, and how do we move beyond those? And in our context, we don't have the general education credit and requirements that you do in the US, at least. We have very vertical degree programs. So how do we help our students understand that their knowledge from the university and the discipline is valuable, but it's limited, and it provides a particular lens that doesn't allow them to necessarily take account of knowledge and insights gained from outside the disciplines. So I suppose, I'm left in this practice, to be absolutely honest, with more questions than answers. I think it's a time and it's a moment for questioning, and it's a moment for solidarity and for thinking about how do we create humanizing spaces. And I've focused really on humanizing spaces is just such a critical element in this work. And I think at this particular moment in the COVID context, I think we need to reimagine what partnership really means. We need to reimagine modes of engagement in the context of incredible global inequality. So sorry, I'm ending a little bit on a downer, and I don't mean to. I just think this work and relationships, because relationships are complex, and I just want to put those center to this work. Thank you.
Wow, another perfect timing. Thanks so much, Janice. A lot of incredible insights. I hope we'll have a little bit of time to unpack. Shorna, I wonder if you'd like to go now, and then hopefully we'll have a little bit of time at the end to just have a discussion amongst us. There's a lot to talk about. There's never enough time, but let's see what we can do.
Yeah, sounds good. Thank you, Richard. And the program that I'll be speaking about today is the Global Citizenship and Sustainability Program. It is a program that my colleague Amy and I created or founded back in 2013 with the mission of strengthening cross-cultural learning through environmental community-based research. I come to the program as a conservation social scientist and as a participatory action researcher, and as someone who, as an undergraduate, was transformed by a community engaged learning experience that I had as a student at Penn State that really shaped my educational trajectory. And so I really think found it to be an important part of education as students are really finding themselves and establishing their identity as a human being, really thinking about the role that relationships with community can really play in their own education, as well as my education, because I feel like I'm a lifelong learner. I'm continuingly learning so much with every from students, from community members. So I consider it a real privilege to be able to engage in this work. And so when we're talking about principles, one of the things that we really try to do in the Global Citizenship and Sustainability Program is to expose students to the kind of political ecology of the region that they're working in. And so conservation, climate change, biodiversity, really understanding how Indigenous communities and the lands that Indigenous communities and their lands are really part of this global landscape, yet they're also critically important to Indigenous communities. So this program takes place in in Malaysian Borneo, which is the third largest island in the world. And it is a home to many indigenous groups, indigenous ethnic groups. And the area is also rich with biodiversity. So we have very high cultural diversity and very high biological diversity. For example, 13 species of primates, and the hornbill that you see here as well, 8 different species. And in indigenous territories encompass up to 22% of the land surface, but hold 80% of the world's biodiversity. And so really thinking about how indigenous lands are important for this global landscape as we think about issues facing our planet, such as climate change, as well as biodiversity, such as the blue kingfisher, the Rafflesia, the world's largest flower, the orangutan, just incredible wildlife in the tropics. And 37 acres of land in the tropics has as much biodiversity and tree species as we have in the entire North America. So it's a pretty incredible place to be, both biologically and culturally. And so that's something that we really impress upon our students. Also that, Southeast Asia is on the front lines of climate change, that much of the rainforests in Malaysian Borneo have been impacted by logging. And a lot of that is because of our global economic system, that palm oil production is responsible for part of that conversion of native forest lands into palm oil production. Up to 50% of products on our grocery store shelves contain palm oil. And so just really helping students see that that it may be a continent, continents away, but we're all connected through our global economic system. And for us to think about even how the decisions we make, or companies we support, or all of these things, that it's all part of this global ecosystem. And these are photographs taken from the plane flying into one of the communities that we work with. So you can really see the destruction across the landscape. And one of this is the island of Borneo, and the black color is intact forest. That this shows forest change over time from 2000 to 2012. And you can see this heart of Borneo is a critically important part of the island, which crosses both Indonesia, Malaysia, and Brunei. But the heart of Borneo is where the heart of the rainforests are. And it's also where the heart of the people are in many ways, that people are one of the most important natural resources if we look at it that way, that there's so much to be gained from kind of understanding how indigenous communities are in relationship to the land, despite all of these threats that are impacting forest lands. And so our project really focuses on the people, that we have an understanding, students gain an understanding of these global forces and how they're impacting local communities. But we really focus on being in relationship to indigenous communities in the state of Sarawak, as you see pictured here, and really documenting and understanding cultural practices, because culture has a demonstrated role in building the resilience of communities to a lot of these perturbations that I described, that building resilience through self-governance, through land claims, through education, through cultural continuity factors. These really allow communities to have that capacity to change and absorb change and disturbance, but still being able to maintain that identity that's so important. And so through the Global Citizenship and Sustainability Program, we really try to structure an educational experience, a pre-departure course and Jumpstart language course that prepares students for the community-based research that this program is based on, that they spend a winter session in Malaysian Borneo living and working alongside community members, and that we also have a post-departure course, and at times also had a summer exchange program at Cornell. More on that if anybody wants to talk about it, but that was a part of the program that we unfortunately had to move away from. But one of the things that I'll mention about the program is that it was a collaboration between the academic side of the university and the student services side of the university, that it was founded with myself as a faculty member and Amy Kuo Chomavong as the associate director of the Public Service Center, which is part of student and campus life at Cornell. So it was this real partnership between kind of two different, what you might call silos at the university or domains at the university, to really come together for the benefit of students. You can tell how long ago this was, Amy. Our kids were quite young in this photograph. But I wanted to mention that it's also partnership is a really critical part of the program. This is University of Malaysia Sarawak that we really wanted to formalize the relationship and partnership with the university through a memorandum of understanding for service learning, to really do the community-based research for resilience in partnership with UNIMAS. And expanding that partnership with University College of Technology in 2019, again, really growing this partnership for students from two Malaysian universities, UNIMAS and UCTS, to work in partnership with students at Cornell University and communities, Penan communities in Long Lemai, an indigenous group, as well as Iban communities in Cebu, also in Sarawak. And just to share a little bit about the indigenous community we work with in Long Lemai, they are the Penan, which is a formerly nomadic tribe. And to the Penan, Tana is the word for forest, and forest is life. And so if we conserve the culture, we're also conserving the forest, that these two things are very much interlinked. And the Penan were formerly a nomadic tribe, and they have many cultural practices, such as hunting with a blowpipe or processing sago, as Matt Poniciello described earlier, or the Oro forest sign language that they utilize to communicate during the nomadic times. And the goal is to really storytelling and remembering, really, these are the principles of the indigenous research projects that we're collaborating on with the Penan, is really storytelling and remembering the nomadic life. Even though they're a settled tribe now, their stories are part of this collective story that's passed from one generation to the next, not just an idealized past, but really remembering and celebrating survival, not focused on the demise or the assimilation, but really the degree to which they've retained cultural values. Also, this idea of returning and archival returns and repatriation and reclaiming of cultural artifacts. So I won't go through all of this, but I want to mention the archival return aspect of this, because we really wanted to emphasize the principles of reclaiming, of recognizing and returning. And so there's a historical collection in our rare manuscript collection at Cornell of photographs taken by Hedda Morrison, a photographer during the 1950s and 1960s. This is one photograph that shows the making of the blowpipe. And so you would need to wear white gloves and make an appointment at the library to be able to access the journals and the photographs. And so we really wanted to, again, think about how to return these artifacts to the community. So we received funding to digitize the photographs and use them to bring them back to the community and really archive the stories that are around the photos. Stories like of one of the first Penan women to go to school, of Linying Late, also known as Tapuk, who Matthew spoke about as well in his presentation. And, you know, they had never seen these photographs before. And so being able to incorporate their stories into an archive that will be part of a digital museum at Cornell's library really embodies those principles that we have in the program. And for the Penan, you know, being resilient is maintaining their identity, that maintaining their traditional knowledge and customs, handicrafts, and language, that is a part of building resilience for their community for the future. And I wanted to just share this quote, which is the secondary title for this conference, Bridging, Bonding, and Spreading, from Garen Jengen, because this is where that phrasing originates, that he said, if we earn something, like what my grandma said, share it with the rest, share it to the rest. What our aim is binding. Binding here means in the community. Bridging means to pass it to another place, and spreading is like some type of networking. And so it's this idea that you bind in the community, you bridge to other communities, and you spread it. And so it's a way of really helping communities as they are moving along a trajectory. And so these are the types of stories that we were able to really uncover through these archival photographs and interviews. So I know we're really short on time, so we're not going to have time to go through it all. But I just wanted to end with really just stressing that for students, we really try to emphasize that people are one of the most important resources for resilience. You know, oftentimes they may be learning about scientific solutions for resilience, whether it's carbon sequestration or infrastructure or greenhouse gas reductions. And so we really try to bring those scientific topics home and think about, well, how are people involved in that? You know, if we conserve native forests, we're sequestering carbon. Globally, that has an impact. So really helping students to see that. And then if I could just close with this of kind of best practices and lessons learned, and all of these are in the words of the Penan. These are direct quotes. One is not rushing for time. This was a lesson that we learned early on, is that we really have to work at the pace of the community, that the academic timeline often does not line up with the community timeline, and we have to be okay with that. That if we rush for a project or anything like that, oftentimes it's not going to be effective, or it's not going to end well, because we really want to be working off of a shared timeline. Kampung time versus city time. So kampung is the word for village, and in Bahasa. And the challenge here is, of course, you know, I would phrase this as differing expectations, and the need to understand that as academics versus students versus community, we all have different expectations, and we have to share what those expectations are with one another, so that we can understand, well, what is it that the community would like to get out of this partnership versus what we would like, and how do we come together on that? The way that this originated was that a community member said, hey, we're going into the forest to collect durian. Would any of the students like to come with us? And we said, sure, we'd love to go on a hike to get some delicious durian fruit. And for them, what was a 30-minute hike into the forest, for them was a 3-hour hike. For us, we didn't have water, we didn't bring, you know, food, anything like that. And it was quite a strenuous hike. And after that, we both learned, okay, there are, you know, what is a 20 to 30 minute hike into the forest for a Panan is very different than us coming into that setting. And so that helped us to talk about our both of our expectations and see where we land. Lastly is stamina, save half for the way back. This was also discovered during one of our hikes, because we do spend a lot of time learning about the natural resources from elders in the community as teachers. And that if we go out hot on the hike, we're not going to have any stamina for the way back. So it taught us about, you know, pacing of projects in a broader sense, that we really have to think about how we pace our projects, that we don't need to do everything at once, that we can really think strategically about what we want to do first, so that we have the energy or the funding or the motivation to really be able to bring a project to its completion. And I had already mentioned about bridging, bonding, and spreading from Uncle Garen in the community of Luang Lamai. So I'll end there, so we have a few minutes, hopefully, to be able to take some questions.
Hi, everybody. Wow, Shorna, wonderful presentation. Thank you. Yeah, if we have some questions, you can either just turn off your mic and share a question, or put it in the chat. We can also share slides. I was trying. I don't know how to take screenshots, so I didn't want to forget some of the things I was seeing. So I was trying to take pictures of some of the really cool slides that you had there, and particularly some of the visuals. I certainly saw some patterns, and I wouldn't, if you don't mind, just take like 1 minute just to share some things that I was processing. There's a lot to process there, but I was struck by the deep way that each of you see relationships with people and place and context. So I think that was one pattern that really stood out. Another one, which I think also came out in the chat, was this kind of sense of humility that each of you bring. So the notion of listening and learning always. So you have this like sort of the depth of the meta awareness that you have around your own identity, your positionality, relations of power was striking. I think this notion of indigeneity was really also part of each of your presentations, and this idea of multiple ways of knowing, and that was a big dimension of it. I think I'll just stop there. Those are some things that I noticed. That I want to just also mention the critically reflective practice that each of you brings is substantial. So it's clear to me that the partnerships you've developed are things that will likely be more sustainable, and will contribute rather than take and extract. So thank you for sharing your insights. Okay, questions?
Well, can I say something, Richard?
Yeah, of course.
Okay. Well, firstly, I think I know what woke me up in the middle of the night. Must be Faith's upcoming talk. I truly, well done, Richard. I think you facilitated the session beautifully and summarized in less than a minute. So I will try to also not hog the bandwidth, right? So, well, all I would like to say is, well, just listening to Michael and Matt, as I joined back, I realized that the service learning program, it's done a lot of things to every one of us. But I think the most important thing that I would like to highlight here is it has helped me to identify myself with an expanding worldview. Where we could bring in well, how others see life. Ability to incorporate values and become more enriched in the process. And this is really what I saw. And this was a commonality among all the three talks just now. It is as though you guys had choreographed this. I mean, it seemed like that because the underlying theme was so vivid, and it was so obvious. So it's really beautiful, and I'm thankful that I'm part of this service learning program. And I just hope that things like people, place, context, that's really what is going to be the same thing that we're going to talk about, and as well bridging and spreading, bridging, bonding, and spreading. These are going to be themes that people are going to look at as what is the main value of service learning program. How can an individual who comes in expand their worldview to enhance their notion of identity such that it becomes much more inclusive, right? Now, no longer just locked up in their own world, but now willing to open up and try to bring in other people's experiences, their own. In a way, I will say the height of what I saw a student do is when they place themselves in the shoes of a community member, and they were trying to solve the problem. Even after the course, I saw the first batch of students. They were talking to the agencies, trying to get some solutions out. And the continuity of what you guys are doing in Cornell are remarkable. In a way, what started 5 years ago is really blossoming into something beautiful. So I think that's how I, in a nutshell, can bring all the experiences together in one picture. I probably don't have enough words, and I'm not speaking as a researcher today. I'm speaking more as a human, and I hope that we can share our worldviews and become enriched and enhance ourselves in the process. Thank you very much, Amy and Shona, for keeping coming back.
Yeah, do others have any questions, or even the panelists, if you have comments or observations that you noticed? And Amy mentioned we can also share the slides, each other's slides, with participants. So if you're wondering.
I think if I can add, Richard, when I look at the present, I think it's okay. You can, I have such admiration for people who can intellectualize and articulate this space, because I can't do that in terms of, I'm a practitioner. I come from industry. I know how to put my hands in and do the work. So I just want to express my acknowledgement of Janice and Shona for presenting it in a way that is intellectualized to the point that it allows the space to be recognized for the work that everybody does. I can do the work, but I can't share the work in the way that you both have today. So I just want to say thank you for that. And then I guess the only other thing is that working in these different spaces, I kind of feel you get overwhelmed sometimes that you can't achieve the outcomes that you want to achieve in the time and the space that you have to achieve them. So how I look at it is, with the students, I guess I'm taking a really long game in this space, because when you talk to students and you start a class and go, who's not here? And you start them thinking, okay, who's not here? And you can't unknow once you know. So when we talk about issues such as structural violence, and they see chairs in public spaces with armchairs that stop people from sleeping, when they graduate and they move into positions of power, that they can start making those decisions to undo those systems of oppression. So that's kind of the approach that I'm taking.
Can I just say something briefly? I think it's interesting, Faith, when you talk about kind of intellectualizing the space. So I appreciate that, but what I'm also beginning to feel for myself is, if I think back in the service learning literature, we're not using the same definitions anymore that we used about a credit bearing experience, that actually means nothing anymore. I think we need to rewrite the descriptions and the definitions of service learning. That's what we need to do, because those are dated for now. The world has shifted on. And I think the notion of credit, I mean, yes, we need all that stuff, but if we're really thinking about the heart of the practice, and it's funny that you talk about yourself as a practitioner, because in many ways, I often feel quite alienated. I'm at a Research One university where this work doesn't really land, you know, and so I've read the field, but I think we just shift the definitions. We disrupt how we define this work because we're missing the point of the human connection. And I think that's, I mean, in Shauna, I was just so struck by the kind of indigenous way of understanding the world, which just cuts right through, you know, excuse the language, but some of the crap that we have in the, you know, in the academy. So I think we've got to rewrite the definitions and you know, because the practices are being shaped, but I think we're not keeping up with how we're languaging it. And we all used quite affective kind of language this evening, which I found really interesting. So I think there's a new project to re-describe the service learning field. I really do think so.
Yeah, if I could jump in, I completely agree with that. And Faith, really appreciate your insights because I feel like the way that you're approaching your program, you call it doing the work. I mean, I feel like that's where the rubber meets the road. Like that's the goal that we're all working towards. And I feel like you've just done an incredible job across, just from what you were describing, across a number of domains with working with disabilities or those with disabilities or other domains. I mean, it's just incredible the breadth of experiences and students that you've been able to touch, I think, through that. And yeah, I mean, it's interesting. We're called the Global Citizenship and Sustainability Program, and we keep that name because it's kind of known, GCS, and we have an acronym, but, you know, in Borneo, we really call it Partnership for Resilience is what we really call it, because that's what it is, you know. But when we originated, it was really in this like global citizenship and, you know, in that realm, and it's really, evolved to really be about the partnership and about building, you know, working alongside communities to build resilience. And so I think this terminology is very much shifting sands. I think it's changing quite a bit, and the service learning terminology, I think, is being replaced with community-based and other types of language, because the narrative really does matter.
And I think that's happening as community partners are moving more into the space. And I can just use domestic violence as an example. You know, victims of domestic violence, survivors of domestic violence, even with disability now, it's, you know, person with a disability, now it's people of all abilities or whoever they want to, and just in the last, you know, that change in the language and the understanding of the space, even within those community sectors, is changing. So you're right, we need to catch up with what the community is doing, because they're owning their own space. And I'm using there, and I feel uncomfortable now that I'm saying it, but these are viable communities that are active and alive, and we're just sitting out here as observers, objectifying or subjecting them to our academic needs or whatever.
Yeah. I think that's why, you know, one of the key principles is self-determination in the program, because I think Matt said it. He said, oh, I was surprised that the community had agency, you know, because you have this romanticized view of an Indigenous community as helpless, and they're everything but. It's actually the definition of resilience. When we're talking about how are we going to be resilient to climate change, look at Indigenous communities. What's their governance structure? What's their decision-making structure? How do they manage their natural resources? Because they've been resilient to many things. The transition from nomadic life to settled life, they changed, had to adapt to so many things: language, culture, religion, education. And they're thriving, you know, so we should be learning from them when we, for things like resilience and adaptation.
Well, again, I just want to thank everybody for a wonderful panel. I learned so much. I almost feel like we need to reconvene and write something together or share it, you know, visually in some other format, but communicate all of the different insights today. So thank you for coming today. We're going to engage in our closing, our pajamas.
Yeah.
And,
It is nearly my bed. It's 16 minutes past 11 in the evening here. So my pajamas are in the bottom half. You get the good.
So clothing and closing are going to happen soon. I did want to just mention one other thing, though, the notion of language. Each of you brought up, the language of the context and the place. And so, the idea, the Tana Shorna, this forest is life. And I've worked with each one of you for a long time. And I know that's something that you've really built into the practice. And when you're working with students, is to ensure that the language and the ways of knowing are appreciated. So I think we did that today. We really modeled, you come from very different contexts and you shared your languages. And there were a lot of things that were patterns in what you talked about, but also there was some uniqueness to everything that you shared. So again, deeply appreciative, and thank you so much. And Amy, you're awesome. I just want to affirm everything that you do. You're so amazing. Nara, I look forward to getting to know you at some point. And, it was a pleasure to meet you. And Shorna, obviously, all the work that you've put into this with others. And Stefan, anyway, I'd love to just, acknowledge everybody's hard work. This was an amazing endeavor. So thank you so much. And thanks for inviting me to be part of it.